past year, we've witnessed and participated in countless dialogues about police and prisons and the future of criminal justice in the United States. More specifically, we've debated, should we increase funding to the police so they're better trained to deal more effectively with the population, or should we defund them and move resources to other parts of the community? Or should we leave the issue alone and let it take care of itself? Scholar, activist, and abolitionist Dr. Angela Davis reminds us that there was once a time when people in the United States believed that slavery could be reformed and restructured into a more progressive system. She cautions that prisons are institutions of modern-day slavery, which are obsolete and must be dismantled to make way for more progressive and less oppressive futures. Our criminal justice system has a long history of upholding racism. Policing and prisons have both and continue to play a role in controlling Indigenous, Black, and Latinx populations following colonization and slavery, Asian populations after the Chinese Exclusion Act and the World War II incarceration of Japanese Americans, and the militarization of the police against immigrants and Muslim people. The deconstructing of oppressive systems and institutions is an essential goal in the pursuit of equity and justice, but the traits of our cultural institutions and systems are not random. The values that our institutions uphold tend to mirror our internal values, our personal belief systems, and our worldviews. This is why dismantling systems isn't an easy task. We're socialized to embody their values and uphold their norms in our individual and interpersonal worlds. And so, Angela Davis would say, it isn't enough to abolish the prisons or the police, but to live in a better, more equitable, more just, more liberated world, we must abolish the values of policing and imprisonment from our minds, our worldviews, our actions, and our interactions. I think there are many internalized values and belief systems that uphold structures like capitalism, racism, and militarized policing, but I want to focus on one human trait in particular that I believe is incredibly pervasive, seldom problematized, and plays a huge role in the ways we as individuals inadvertently perpetuate oppression in our daily lives. This trait is called the punitive impulse. If you've ever felt so angry with someone you wanted to hit them, or if you ever were intentionally rude or cold to someone who had bothered you, or if you ever felt motivated to get even with someone, or see someone get what they deserve, you may have been experiencing the punitive impulse. The punitive impulse is the urge to inflict punishment upon another after a perceived offense. Recent research has unveiled a lot of new information about the punitive impulse. One study found that when witnessing a crime, participants were 10 times more likely to attempt to fight the offender than they were to offer help to the victim. In other words, their punitive impulse was so strong, it actually got in the way of them offering help when their help may have been needed. Other research suggests that there may actually be an addictive component to punishment, where inflicting a punishment engages the reward system of the brain and seems to feel good. The punitive impulse interests me for a few reasons. First, it's very common and very powerful. So powerful that our entire justice system is based upon the idea of retribution. We punish people who break the law by fining them or sending them to prison or putting them on probation. Our justice system, like our impulses, is punitive. Our retributive justice system often succeeds in its purpose of ensuring that people who break the law are punished for their actions and also removed from society, which can help those impacted feel a greater sense of safety. However, there's an awful lot of evidence that suggests that our justice system of crime and punishment fails our communities in a few ways. First, it is error-prone, and unfortunately we know that sometimes the guilty are not brought to justice and the innocent are wrongfully punished. Second, it doesn't necessarily prevent crime. It primarily intervenes when a crime has already been done. Third, it affords the impacted party or parties very little authority in the process of addressing crime and wrongdoings, and it offers them no healing or reparation for the crime done. Finally, very often the offender receives no support in behavioral change or reintegration into the community when their punishment is over, which can lead to so many future problems, including reoffending. As we know from our scholars and activists like Angela Davis, society functioned before a retributive criminal justice system ever existed, and it can survive again without it. But how do we fit into a world that does not rely on crime and punishment if our brains are so hardwired to impulsively inflict punishment? An alternative to our current justice system is restorative justice. Restorative justice is a philosophy for resolving crime and victimization that focuses on healing and rehabilitation for three parties: the offender, the wronged individual, and the community. Restorative justice is often thought of as a more socially just approach to dealing with wrongdoings because the community at large is involved, there's an emphasis on prevention and healing, and the individuals impacted are more empowered to determine ideal outcomes. Restorative justice does not mean that people who cause harm are not held accountable for their actions. I would argue that it actually makes accountability more possible and empowers those who are victimized to have a say in what accountability looks like. Restorative practices can be used interpersonally or systemically. Before the colonization on this land, many indigenous societies here were governed by restorative practices, and there are cultures around the world that embrace these practices today. And that's why I'm confident that despite how hardwired we may be to punish, we can learn another way. I don't think that silencing the punitive impulse is an easy task, but I do think that it's possible, and I think that it's part of the process through which we liberate ourselves and our communities from oppression and the perpetuation of violence. So I propose 5 factors which we can all take responsibility for exercising in order to begin to silence that punitive impulse. And as a disclaimer, when you've been wronged or harmed in any way, a huge variety of difficult emotions, anger, sadness, disgust, devastation, confusion, betrayal, regret, can all surface and be really overwhelming. And I'm not here to judge the ways in which people react to pain or harm. And we're all in charge of our emotions and how we choose to cope with them. So this talk is not about how you should feel or respond when something bad happens to you. This talk is about what you might do instead when you feel the punitive impulse arising inside of you before acting on it. It's a model for reflection and guiding decision-making to make room for transformation and restorative practices when they're possible in your individual life. So these practices are in no particular order, but the first practice is dialectical thinking. To put this simply, dialectical thinking involves understanding that 2 or more different or even opposing ideas can both be true and real and matter. Now, this is relevant to punishment because we usually rationalize the punishment and the subsequent suffering of people who have done bad things by saying they deserve it because they're bad. It is usually the case, though, that someone who's done something bad has also at some point done something good, and that those who do good are also capable of bad. And this is an example of dialectical thinking. In other words, there are no bad people and there are no good people. There are only people who are capable of both good and bad things. When I engage in dialectical thinking, I can say, you hurt me and I'm angry with you for that, and you do not deserve to suffer. The next practice for silencing the punitive impulse is radical empathy. Radical empathy is all about perspective taking. It is the process of actively trying to understand the experiences and feelings of others, even when they do not match our feelings and experience. Radical empathy sort of follows dialectical thinking in our effort to silence the punitive impulse because it allows us to go from, I accept that people who do bad things do not necessarily deserve to suffer, to people who do bad things might have reasons, and it might be important for me to know those reasons. When people feel unsafe or are unable to access the resources to have their basic needs met or have enduring trauma, they may begin to operate from what we call survival mode. And in survival mode, we literally cannot afford to make decisions based upon the system of good and bad. We may do bad because we will not survive if we don't. We may do bad because it was the only way we were ever taught to do. We may do bad because we have been through so much hurt and abuse that we believe we are bad, and we start to embody it. So I think that bad is usually not as simple as a choice, and I think it's often socialized or learned or forced, and I think it's preventable. In order to reduce my punitive impulse, I might be open to the idea that someone who wronged me did not do so because they're bad or hateful or malicious, but maybe there's another reason that I, as someone who was harmed, cannot see. It might actually benefit me in my healing to open up to that possibility. The next practice for silencing the punitive impulse is logical reasoning. In this case, logical reasoning is understood as the opposite of emotional reasoning. In other words, it involves making decisions with logic, not emotions. This is incredibly challenging. When we're dealing with injustice and wrongdoing, the most powerful and painful of all of our emotions are likely to surface. And again, it's not to say that they shouldn't. Our emotions offer a lot of important information to us and should always be valued and taken into consideration. However, logical reasoning can support the best long-term interest of the affected parties. When we operate from emotional reasoning, we're bad communicators, and we may be more inclined to favor short-term relief than long-term solutions. When logical reasoning is employed in decision-making, people harmed by wrongdoing may be more effective in having their voices heard and their needs met than those who rely on emotional reasoning and the punitive impulse. So when the punitive impulse arises, it might be useful to pause, notice those emotions, allow them to come without judgment, but avoid decision-making until you're able to access logical reasoning. The fourth practice of silencing the punitive impulse is developing a collective identity or a sense of belonging and responsibility to our communities. The punitive impulse is very individual and very isolating. It's all about self-preservation, the ego, and individual power. Restorative justice, on the other hand, requires a value for others, for community, and for humanity at large. The consequences of our actions and reactions directly impact those around us. Appreciating the impact of our actions, taking responsibility for our role in communities, and valuing the best interests of those around us builds a collective identity. This collective identity may make us more inclined to abolish our self-serving punitive impulses and operate from a more dialectical and radically empathic ideology. The final practice in silencing the punitive impulse involves rethinking our very definitions of justice. As we explored earlier in this talk, our current system and ideology around justice says that retribution brings justice. The punishment should fit the crime. And this understanding that justice can only be gained by retribution only perpetuates harm. It does not prevent harm, and worst of all, it fails to get at the roots of why harm was done in the first place. We do not have to understand justice this way. Justice as a system for righting wrongs does not need to involve punishment at all. Instead, we might think about justice as a process of restoring balance in our lives and in our communities. Wrongs should still be made right. Harm and maltreatment should not be acceptable or excused. But if justice is a process of restoring balance rather than giving people what they deserve, harm may still be reduced, and importantly, the likelihood of harm reoccurring may also be reduced. Restorative justice is a socially just approach to dealing with crime and wrongdoing in our communities. I believe the events of our history as a nation and as a species have called upon us to urgently reconsider our opinions about punishment and consider more dialectical, empathic, logical, collective, and balanced ways of responding to one another, especially in times of injustice.